This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Dan Morrison from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Today, we speak with Daniel Menchik, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Arizona. Dan is the author of Managing Medical Authority: How Doctors Compete for Status and Create Knowledge, which was published in 2021 by Princeton University Press. Menchik's research focuses on the cultures and social organization of medicine, science, and expert work more generally. I reviewed the book for Contemporary Sociology, and I'm delighted to have Dan on the Annex. Our conversation was recorded on October 25th, 2023. Dan Menchik, welcome to the Annex, and thanks for joining me to talk about your work.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I really enjoyed reading the book and writing the review. I was super impressed by the field work that you've done, the duration. So we'll talk about all those things. But as the title of your book suggests, it's about how doctors maintain, defend, and advance their professional status and power. You focus on cardiologists and electrophysiologists. And I think most people have heard of cardiology. They know something about what that profession does, but might be less familiar with what electrophysiologists do. So can you briefly explain that form of practice? And, so what do EPs do, and how are they different from other kinds of cardiologists?
Well, cardiologists, as we know, deal with the heart, and there are a couple of different subfields of cardiology. Electrophysiology, as you mentioned, but also interventional cardiology. The way the electrophysiologists describe the differences between those subfields is in terms of us and them, in the same way that lots of professionals think about them versus us. So the general cardiologists may work with technologies that are simple, like pills, that sort of thing. Interventional cardiologists deal with stents, and the cardiac electrophysiologists call them the plumbers, whereas the electrophysiologists are the electricians. So that kind of work involves dealing with arrhythmias, that is, abnormal heart disorders. So they may put in pacemakers, or they may ablate or burn parts of the heart to fix the arrhythmias. So they're dealing with surgical techniques, just like other kinds of surgeons might, but they're also dealing with interpretations of EKGs and all sorts of readouts that the technologies offer them. So I thought it was a really valuable area to give us a sense of how work operates in all sorts of different medical areas. I wanted to capture medical work generally, and this area had elements of tasks that you'd see in a lot of different areas. Also, relationships with other outsiders like device companies, hospitals, all sorts of other stakeholders that, as anybody who's taken a look at medicine in the last 3 decades have seen, are pretty important in medicine these days.
I'm teaching a course on health and medicine right now. We're just reading about the development of medical schools and the Flexner report and hospitals as a workplace and Strauss's negotiated order and all kinds of things. And it makes this conversation really timely for me, and especially because you're talking about these very highly trained specialists who interface with all kinds of other professionals, but also institutions, organizations, businesses, for-profit and nonprofit entities, and so on. It really shows how complex, medical practice has been complex for a while, but how increasingly the number of stakeholders has increased, and the coordination of all that work is super important as well.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that came out of observing this world is the need for theoretical interventions that would allow us to make sense of all of these different stakeholders, because we don't just see competitions between one professional group versus another professional group, or any kind of competing interests between outsiders, say industry, and a pure profession. We see interdependence. We see all sorts of ways in which companies protect the doctors from making mistakes that are going to make the companies look bad. That doesn't represent a kind of countervailing power that places them at odds with one another in a kind of zero-sum relationship. So I agree. I mean, the terrain of medicine has changed considerably. To a certain degree, industry's always been involved in medicine. Doctors don't make their own drugs. They don't certainly make their own technology. So there's often been a role for industry, but in terms of the theory, it hasn't always been there. So one of the goals here was to, for instance, bring new concepts to the table, like occupational project, that included all of these stakeholders who were working to create a set of medical problems and a set of medical solutions that represented their interests.
All right, that's a great segue into one of my questions I got queued right up here, Dan. So in my review of your book, I also focus primarily on the concepts you develop that help explain the mechanisms doctors use in competitions over status in concert with these other actors we've been talking about. So within the overall framework of an occupational project, concepts like organizing indeterminacy, tethers, and venues allow you to get a more complex view of status. So can you describe these concepts and a bit about how you developed them during your research?
Absolutely. The book is organized as a study of 6 different venues that begin at the bedside in residency programs in hospitals and move to the labs in which the work is being done and the executive boardrooms in the hospital where doctors interact with administrators, and then also outside of the hospital in meetings where fellows are trained, advanced electrocardiologists, places where doctors learn from companies who are developing new technologies that those companies would like those doctors to use. And then finally in the international conferences where new innovations are rolled out, discussed, argued over, and so on. I think of all of these places as venues, that is, places where tasks organize to a considerable degree the interactions that go on in them. I mean, if you have a patient who's uncontrollably bleeding, you're not going to ponder the ethics of using an extra sponge or the economics of it, right? You're going to try to fix that problem, right? So the task really organizes the practice. They constrain them, not completely, but to a considerable degree. So the challenge is developing concepts that are going to connect these venues, because if you're doing ethnography, you're going to see situations. But as any ethnographer knows, a lot of what happens in those situations is influenced by things that happen in other situations. So the concept of tether was really valuable for me. I used tether to mean linkages across these venues that people use to strengthen their individual and occupational projects. So these linkages could be words, they could be technologies, they could even be people, like a field worker who's wheeled out at an international conference to show all the prospective fellows that the laboratory is really a friendly place to be. By the head of that laboratory. So these tethers were analytically valuable to me to connect these venues, and I thought a methodological contribution.
One more concept that I thought was really important, and it goes to doctors' efforts to build their status and reputation in the field, is organizing indeterminacy. You talked earlier about the variety of things that EPs do in terms of interpreting EKGs, other forms of evidence. Can you say more about that concept?
Absolutely. One of the ways that I saw that, for instance, these tethers were useful was in organizing indeterminacy, helping establish what are the key problems, medical problems that people have according to these doctors, and what solutions should be used to deal with them, whether it's technologies or drugs or not even doing any kind of intervention. And the process of establishing and arguing over and debating these problems and solutions was one of organizing indeterminacy. It's not as if they knew that these were the set of diagnoses and these were the set of treatments that were necessary, and they felt uncertainty, which is a concept that we have a long history of engaging in sociology. And certainly we saw some of that in my field notes. But when you're looking at the establishment of knowledge in a profession, then there's nothing to be uncertain about. You're actually looking at the ways indeterminacy is negotiated. So I'll give an example. At one of the conferences that was sponsored by a device company, there was a professional, high status physician who said, well, if you want to treat this problem, you need to ablate the antrum or burn the antrum. And then started laughing and said, if you believe in the antrum. And as an ethnographer, it's like, if you believe in it, if you believe in this part of anatomy. So of course, as an ethnographer, I had to go up afterwards and he said, oh, well, the antrum is a concept that someone in the field has come up with that we don't really believe his data about. We don't trust him. Mm-hmm. So it was contested anatomy. So it was indeterminate how this particular problem should be solved. And the tether, the antrum that this person has tried to use to connect venues really was not acceptable to the folks at this event.
I love the idea of studying failed knowledge, sort of either things that people thought were there but turned out not to be there, or couldn't gather enough evidence for to convince folks, or, and this is a different thing from what we've been talking about, but projects that were abandoned, whether that was lack of empirical support or anomalies that couldn't be either rectified, or theories that couldn't account for anomalies, things like that. Anyway, we don't have to talk about that right now. That's one of the super interesting things that came for me from reading your book. Well, that's a good segue in terms of talking about this conference to thinking about the research process. So you completed this field work from 2005 to 2018. I think that's a record for at least books that I have read on ethnography in the field. Kathy Sharmaz, Good Days, Bad Days, I think spent about 10 years with her respondents for that book. But this is quite a bit of time. So my question is, how did your relationship with the groups you studied change across these years?
It's a really good question, and it was a long time. I began in a residency program, like many other classic medical sociology, ethnography field workers have, observing how it is that knowledge gets into practice. That was always my goal, in light of the fact that we have often understood hospitals as total institutions that may control everything that gets done to the inmates. But at the same time, in medicine, authority and legitimacy come from integrating ideas from outside, right? The scientific community. So that was a puzzle. And so I was studying the residency program until I got kicked out. After about a year and a half, I was taking calls, staying up all night with these doctors, sleeping in the rooms where they took call. And it was the case that the hospital was being investigated for some particular unexpected deaths. And I was interviewed by the police. Who's this outsider who is hanging around? And the chief residents, it turned out, were charged with making it so there wasn't some outsider who was observing. Now, of course, the police officers bonded with me because they also are considered to be outsiders in the hospital, right? So at that stage, I started looking for other venues to observe in that hospital. And it was, in many ways, the best thing that could have happened to me, because the cardiac electrophysiologists, this was a hospital in which the kind of interpretive work, ethics work, conversational types of treatments, at least ones that don't necessarily involve intervention, surgical interventions, were dominant. So they were happy to get some attention. And so they invited me into their labs. They invited me to come to their conferences. They invited me to come to their interactions with device companies. So over time, they became the focus, and they enabled me to study the relationship between the doctors who were presenting slides, PowerPoint slides in the hospital, with other doctors who shared those slides and presented them at the international conferences. So I could see connections between those venues. So getting kicked out was really one of the best things that ever happened to me. You know, one of the affordances of taking my time with this project is it enabled me to observe some of these relationships between distant venues and the local ones. So I was able to see a policy at the hospital, at Superior Hospital, change that made it so they restricted beds that were available to the cardiac electrophysiologists who I was studying. And when they didn't have those beds, then they couldn't get in patients that would enable them to gain status in their field. So they couldn't get cases that they could write up in JAMA or the New England Journal of Medicine. They couldn't get cases from their colleagues across town who really needed someone to take care of their sick but poor and poorly insured patient. They couldn't get the kind of work that they entered the field to do. So because of that new policy, they left the hospital and moved to a rival run across town. So it let me see whether the strains that I thought these physicians were experiencing were real and if they were really acute. And so that was a real valuable affordance.
That story of an administrative decision affecting the allocation of a resource that these professionals need in order to maintain and build their reputations and indeed their careers in terms of their status and authority and access to grants, access to publishing opportunities, international conferences, then becoming the trainers of the next generation of EPs and so forth, certainly reminds me as a practicing sociologist and professor of our own work in the academy and how many times folks are trained in, if not resource rich, then environments that are more resource rich than the environments in which they end up practicing, and how sometimes those disconnections cause, tension and angst and other forms of unhappiness. Clearly, like professor, that's an expert work occupation to a certain extent. Anyway, what did you learn that you think was the professoriate like in the back of your mind as you're working through this project with EPs? And maybe as you got further in, did the parallels become more apparent?
Well, there certainly were quite a few. I mean, the doctors are different than professors in all sorts of ways that are consequential. So they need to get referrals, especially these doctors who are far down the referral chain. They depend on general cardiologists who depend on general practitioners in order to get their quote resources, right? These patients. So they need to maintain good relationships with them. So as I said, when they don't have these resources at the hospital, when they don't have their beds, then they can't maintain those relationships with colleagues. So there were clearly some differences there. They have relationships with industry that we don't necessarily have, as at least from my standpoint. Certainly, textbook companies. I don't know about you, solicit me not infrequently to try out their new textbook, and there are some parallels there. I think they don't show up at my office in the same way and don't offer to buy elaborate dinners and fly me to exotic locations. But maybe my experience is different than other people in other locations in the profession. So there's.
I'm waiting for that. I'm waiting for that invitation from Norton to the junket to an exotic location. Although the magnetic pins with Du Bois and Anna Julia Cooper are nice, I must say.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't make me buy their products, but in any case, that is an important difference between doctors and professors. We generally aren't being feted with elaborate dinners and exotic locales. Although my inbox is full of solicitations for intro and social problems textbooks for sure. Well, I want to pick up on one thing you said earlier, and it goes to an issue with ethnographic fieldwork that is typically bounded. So one big lesson from the book is that researchers studying status should move beyond the immediate site of practice. So essentially that gaining and maintaining status is the result of a complex network structure that includes the work site, but extends well beyond it. So how does this approach, compare to maybe other studies?
Well, I mean, this problem of detecting distant influences to me was a really salient one. I mean, as I said, if you're going to do ethnographies, you're going to see situations. And if you stay in one venue, you're going to see situations. A literature that has been really influential to me has been scholarship in anthrolinguistics, in particular work that focuses not only on the what is culture, but the where is culture. The work of, for instance, Michael Silverstein and his students, to me, really changed the way I think about ethnographic fieldwork, and especially in terms of focusing my attention on dimensions of language. And so when terms like the antrim is mentioned, I understand that this is a person that is persona non grata within the profession. And by doing that, I can see why it is this person his techniques are not being used in the hospital, but also he's not being invited to the international conferences. So I can see those kinds of absences that you mentioned before and make some sense of them by looking at the language that's used and a language that's not used. And it's hard to get at that if you are going to just study hospital. So you may talk about normative errors, problems that are considered to be really acute in terms of the kinds of practices of residents. I mean, Charles Bosk's work, Forgive and Remember, was the reason I started doing medical sociology, and in particular, theory building medical sociology. And he talks about, in the second edition of this book, the ways in which he's rethought the category of normative errors, the most severe kind of error that a resident can commit, right? The kind that involves not doing informed consent with a patient, or not telling your attending that something bad happened the night before, breaking the no surprises rule, right? Yeah. And in the second edition, Bosk says, well, I'm not so sure that the violations that I described as normative errors, ones that led to the expulsion of a resident from a training program, were actually ones that were based in the norms of a profession. In fact, it had more to do with more local kinds of lack of attention to hierarchy and also gender. And so if you're outside of the hospital, you can get a sense of what those norms are, right? But it's hard to do that if you are just looking at one hospital. I mean, the book is a tour de force, and it's very brave and admirable that Bosk in the second edition revised his interpretations of his data. It would be amazing if that happened more in great works. But one way of overcoming that limitation is to actually look outside the situations and the venues in the hospital.
Well, I didn't know we shared this, Dan, but Forgive and Remember is the reason why I became a medical sociologist as well. And one of the reasons why I think I chose the dissertation topic and the method that I did, which involved following around a team of medical professionals and watching them do surgeries and watching them argue about the condition that a patient had and interpreting symptoms and following those patients and talking with them. And of course, we lost Bosk, I think a couple of years ago now, and his memory is alive with many of us. So if listeners have not read Forgive and Remember, either edition, but the second edition, I think especially I would commend to our readers. I think it's a very important book in the field of medical sociology. And he gave a great talk about the second edition and the reception of the book as well that I was able to be at, which I thought was very enlightening. And so folks who haven't read the second edition, you can read the second edition and learn more about what went on in the creation of the first edition. I know many of us miss Bosk a lot. Well, your book addresses several issues of interest to medical sociologists, but of course, it's more important than that. As important as that is, medical sociology is an important thing for many of us, but also folks who study professions and elite workers, the creation of knowledge, the creation of research programs, and the maintenance of those programs. I kept thinking about the classics in the sociology of science and knowledge, like the idea of invisible colleges that link professionals across venues, about professional jurisdictions, and even both, as I mentioned earlier, like even fictional or academic treatments of status among professors. So Bourdieu has, Homo academicus, for example. But I'm curious about the kinds of projects that you would like to see developed from the conceptual tools that you've developed, maybe things that you yourself are doing, things that maybe students or other folks are doing, or things that you think, I'd like to see someone pick up these ideas and bring them to maybe a different context.
One of the things that was really striking about the doctors' relationships with the companies that I think I mentioned is that the companies were helping the doctors help themselves collectively. So at the events in which the doctors were interacting with device representatives, and device representatives saying, here's a new technology for burning this part of the heart to fix the arrhythmia, those company reps would actually watch whether the doctors really could perform the procedure. And when they didn't think that they could, and they said they wanted to prevent creating a quote, a 007, give someone a license to kill, they would sanction those physicians. Obviously, they couldn't do it directly because the statistics was so high, but they could speak to the colleagues of that physician and say, this person, it's not safe for them to be doing procedures. So we need to prevent them from using this technology. And so that's, of course, valuable to the doctors as well, collectively, because they don't want people making visible errors that make everybody else look bad and lead general cardiologists to either just give their patients some kind of antiarrhythmic drug or decide that the patient should go to an interventional cardiologist or some area that wouldn't be optimal for them. That was a fascinating pattern that I was observing, and made me wonder about arm's length relationships. If you're dependent on these companies, but at the same time, it's problematic to get too close to them or to be perceived as being too close to them. And so I would love to see more work done and on arm's length relationships, how these ties are managed. It was fascinating to see the doctors at these international conferences were proud of the number of companies that they worked with. They were skeptical of people who worked with just one. But if they had a long list, then it showed they're accessing all of the new technologies, that they're equal opportunity in terms of the companies that they work with. And so it wasn't stigmatized in the way that I initially thought it might be. So ways of thinking about the role of money in medicine that aren't simplistic or polemical was really of interest to me. So that's something that I'm thinking about a little more in my work and would love to see more in the field. Some of the other projects that I've started working on and talking to people about involve other observations. So one of the highest compliments you can give these doctors is that they have good hands, right? So why is it that some of them have chosen to, in their words, go blind with their hands and use robotic technology, accept automation in their work? And who are the doctors who use it, and who are the doctors who aren't willing to let the algorithm take over the navigation of the catheter in their patients? Right? If you're a doctor at a high status center, Stanford, Chicago, Brigham and Women's, Columbia, you get the zebras, you get the patients that no one can take care of, and certainly no algorithm is going to be able to heal. So you also gain status in the lab, in the hospital, in the profession, from your dexterity. So there's no way that you're using these robotics. And the doctors who are practicing in Peoria don't want to deal with these patients. So they're happy to send them along to you. And those doctors who, want to get to work at 9 o'clock and go home at 3 o'clock and go play golf and drive their Porsches, they're happy to let the algorithm take over. And one of the things that they've told me, written a few papers on this now, is it really helps preserve their bodies. They sit in a different room. They're not next to the fluoroscopy or the X-ray, so it's better for them, and it enables them to reduce the kind of other kinds of professional risks that might come from a mistake. So there's a real interdependence between those doctors that is connected to the new robotic technology, in the same way that, as I mentioned, you have this interdependence between the companies and the doctors. So those are some of the things I've been thinking about lately.
So just to flesh out a little bit in terms of what it looks like to actually use these catheters, if you're an EP, you're threading this small instrument through the body, you're wearing a heavy suit that's protecting you, a metal suit that's protecting you, or at least a gown of some kind that's protecting you from the X-rays, which you need in order to guide this thing through the body to the right area of the heart. You're on your feet for a long period of time, and then you're using you're in the pre-algorithm days, you're using your hands to maneuver this catheter through, obviously, like blood vessels, right? And so this is steering in close quarters for a long time, having to hit the exact right spot to do the ablation or placing the electrodes for the pacemaker, things like that.
Absolutely. So you're on your feet, you're wearing 30 pounds of lead, you are bending over a patient, you are right next to fluoroscopy. So radiation is a big concern, and lately there's been cancer concerns. And so it's physically taxing. Sometimes these procedures, especially the ones you described, where you're working an ablation catheter up through the femoral artery into the left ventricle and across the septum, so you can get to the part of the heart that you will burn. It involves a lot of maneuvering of the catheter. It takes a long time, and so it's one in which, if you can get some relief from standing and from being so close to fluoroscopy, it's going to be valued by some. But for some, it's not worth it, right? Because their status is so important to them, and they don't feel that these technologies will enable them to have the kind of precision that they feel that they need to have. And it's also the case, if a fellow can do it, or a resident can use this joystick, then what are they offering to the profession? So their comparative advantage with respect to their skills is really compromised. So it's something that really draw my attention to the importance of the body in terms of decision making around technologies, and that's something that I didn't expect to be part of it, but is actually a really important factor in the use of these gizmos.
I mean, I'm thinking in terms of like longevity of practice. Best hospitals are going to have the newest, latest, and greatest. But what you're saying is that for this occupational group at the highest end, that technology is actually seen as either not fit for the kinds of problems that they like to deal with, and they're status enhancing for their careers, and also represents perhaps a threat to, you might call it, the craft of doing electrophysiology and these ablation procedures, other things that are of the highest technical complexity.
Yeah, I thought it was interestingly counterintuitive also, because these are the folks on the margins of the social networks of EP. They're not the opinion leaders who are accepting it. And often those are the people that, at least in the diffusion literature, we understand to be the early adopters of the technologies, but it wasn't that at all. And to a certain degree, those folks are important in shaping use, because if they say, I'm not touching this thing, then people will quote those folks at, say, the University of Michigan, which is one of the key nodes in EP's invisible colleges. Penn is the other place. If one of those folks says, I'm not touching this thing, then it really can influence other opinion leaders' practices. But the action is happening on the margins there, which is different than what Coleman showed us.
Yeah, okay. Super fascinating. I want to go back a little bit to the idea of the arm's length relationship and the role of device makers. When I was doing field work, there was a device representative in the room, both while the device I was studying was being implanted, but also in the different person in the meetings, evaluating patients. And that person was there to advise, was there to talk about products and things. But I'm super interested in where the interface is with kind of influence and money. One time that representative during the general meeting offered to sponsor like a lunch for the whole group, like a Thanksgiving time lunch or some holiday kind of lunch. That was rejected on like conflict of interest grounds. But it wasn't done by a doctor. It was done by one of the staff people, which is super interesting to me. So who manages the conflict is a potential question. I didn't follow that up in my own work, but it is a super interesting question, especially as you know, right? The device makers and their representatives are in the room where the action is when the device is being used, which is the same for the device that I was looking at.
It's a fascinating position. It's a fascinating role, right? Because they're doing the teaching here. They have the expertise that they developed at the company, and they are in a situation in which they have the respect of these physicians because the physicians need the expertise, but at the same time, they can also be abused by these physicians because they're so far down in terms of social status. It's a durable role because they will constantly be exposed to the newest technologies from their company and be able to share that with those doctors. But it's a hard one to be in, so that their organization, say Medtronic, or Boston Scientific, has to come up with systems for rotating them among practices, for instances, if they want to maintain morale.
Oh, that's interesting.
With these reps, because the reps are really abused sometimes. And there are real questions about their value, right? There's a kind of ambivalence here. If they're banned from the hospitals, there's a cost in terms of education of residents and doctors, senior physicians. But at the same time, there are some conflicts of interests that these hospitals are very conscious of. So I think your question about managing them is a really salient one, and there's really no easy answer on it.
Yeah, some of my favorite sociology is sort of process oriented, right? So how do people manage tensions over time? What are the sources and the negotiations that happen, which I think is consistent with some of the themes in your work. Well, one of the questions I like to ask authors after the book comes out is, what has surprised you, if anything, about the reception of this book? Is there anything you might change in terms of emphasis or things that you now recognize readers are more interested about or less interested about than maybe you were as you were putting together the book and then having it reviewed and going through that process?
Well, I didn't know what to expect. I kind of expected a black hole given COVID, and I'm grateful for my colleagues for invitations. I was happy to do an NPR interview, which was kind of a bucket list item. But with fewer in-person conferences, it's really hard to know what kind of impact you may be having, if any. I got some indication at the last ASA that some people have been reading it, which was really edifying. And part of that is possible because more people are studying the social organization of medicine these days than 15 years ago, which is really, really exciting. I did get some feedback from physicians. I got something right about them. I was interviewed for one of their journals. So I'm a part of their world. Now they know a little bit more about a sociologist. In early days, they would say things like, let's have the sociologist have the end of life conversation with the patient. reflects all sorts of misconceptions about what our expertise is. I guess in terms of other elements, I focused on relationships across venues, and this really makes sense for this community. Probably could have theorized knowledge-making dynamics in venues or shops a little bit more. How do the dynamics among local group members, dynamics like hierarchy, the allocation of credit, how do these organize knowledge processes? So I'm doing some work in that area these days, in focusing on the production of social knowledge, in particular in sociology. I've been drawing on archival data on two different shops. I'm calling these social knowledge shops that are conducting research on similar subjects. This is archival work on shops in Chicago and at Columbia. I haven't totally traded in the shop floor for the archive in my work. I'm doing some field work in a machine shop here in Tucson that's been valuable for studying automation, and it's also been valuable for keeping me honest with the shop metaphor. But understanding those places and communities, and especially in the ways in which their knowledge is shaped by external players, like say foundations, or members of the field site that have allowed them into those communities. Understanding how those our knowledge practices in sociology are shaped by clients, has been of real interest to me. Is coming out of my previous work. So, I'm sucking dust as an archival researcher these days, and it's been rewarding.
Well, that sounds really exciting. Dan, I really appreciate you writing this book. There were many times where I reflected on things that I had seen in my own field experience in a hospital and tracking how doctors and others work together. I want to transition a little bit to more contemporary, pop culture things, the banter segment. I really want to talk about what's happened to Twitter or X and where folks in sociology are going to land. So Social Twitter had been a great resource for many people. Maybe, Dan, can you say something about maybe how you use social Twitter or engaged in those conversations?
Mostly as a lurker, as a way to keep up with what conversations are happening in sociology among my colleagues, learn about new books, learn about new articles. It's valuable in that sense.
And I will say I certainly learned a lot through social Twitter for many of the same reasons, and often guests on the NX come from a discussion that happens on Twitter or someone talking about an article or a series of articles or the book that has just come out or is about to come out. And so it's been a great resource for building our guest list here on the NX, and also, as you say, keeping up to date with new ideas and sort of trends in the discipline. Obviously, it's not a sample in any sense, but it does give you an indication of what at least folks there on that platform are interested in. I will say, I think we're in a period of transition with all of these other platforms. I mean, obviously, Mastodon came on, Post, Threads, which is more recent, and then Blue Sky, which is I guess founded by the guy who founded Twitter. It feels to me like we're in a really unsettled place with social Twitter, although Blue Sky seems to have a similar kind of hashtag and following system. I mean, all these platforms are somewhat similar, and I'll be very interested to see how things shake out. I know some people are very into Mastodon, others are just really unsettled, and we'll see when a transition point happens where folks consolidate. But I'm missing social Twitter quite a bit.
Yeah, I've been struck by the atrophy in terms of the number of people that are contributing there. It was a valuable source of weak-tide knowledge that I relied upon, at least in times of procrastination. I suspect there's noise on all of the platforms, and none of them are going to have the ideal composition or purity that we would like, but it would be great to have another kind of public sphere venue if we ever have online. We'll see.
Well, I'm going to resist the urge to make a comment about ASA Connect Rest in peace, ASA Connect. But we'll go back to our listservs. And this is not on topic necessarily at all, but I mean, I've seen that academia.edu is now transitioning to somewhat more of a post-centric sort of little quips and things versus a repository for one's preprint or CV and other kinds of things. So I find that very interesting, that the space that's kind of been opened up by the absence of an effective Twitter.
I suspect that it'll be monetized soon enough if it hasn't done already. Although it's nice if interactions are happening around papers and ideas and work that people are coming out with, because we have a problem of abundance, right? There's too much to read. We're expected to produce a lot, and and so if there's a venue in which you can see work that is really valuable to your own work and your own interests, and be exposed to some new ideas, that's all for the good.
I think that really is a huge issue, the fact that there is just so much to read. I mean, especially if you do anything beyond extremely narrow kinds of questions or any kind of interdisciplinary stuff, or if you're trying to get into a new field, just the volume of things that you need to read to get up to speed is daunting for sure. I don't know how people keep up with it, those who even have decently low teaching loads, and they have other kinds of things to do too, like supervise graduate students and read dissertations and proposals. I'm
writing a piece for on the Central Organization of Medicine for the Annual Review of Sociology right now, and I feel your pain. It's too much, and I think Andy Abbott has written about this. Before the 70s, people would write one or two things over their careers because that's what they had to say, but the expectations are different now. So given that and the expansion of number of people in that profession, keeping up is a real challenge.
Yeah.
Right?
I was just reading something about the average number of citations on papers has also gone up significantly. So if there look back in AJS and there's some real stuff you probably don't want to dig up in AJS from the early days of the journal, or you do maybe for antiquarian or other interests. But we're talking papers that had 6, less than a dozen citations. And the things I write now, or we write to get me and my collaborators, 40 is not unusual. It's an issue. But you don't want to leave people out, and you want to be, as comprehensive as possible. And there are still things that I find where I say, oh man, that should have been in the first draft.
And we see journals changing as a consequence, right? I think some of them have now made it so that citation lists don't count in word counts. And that's one way of managing the fact that in order to motivate a paper and to describe its implications, there are more to engage with.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, there's the issue of folks citing articles that are in the journal that you're publishing in order to increase the, impact factor of that journal. I mean, I haven't experienced this a bunch, like in reports that I get back, but the anecdote that I continually hear is folks getting reports back and saying, okay, you need to cite these pieces that just so happen to have appeared in the journal that you are getting your review from. And so that seems like a dodgy practice.
So entrapment is happening not just in medicine.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those things that professions often have to, part of being a professional, right, is having somewhat of like a fiduciary responsibility that with a certain amount of professional autonomy and independent decision making and relationships to other kinds of professionals and service providers, that you actually have a commitment to the core mission of the discipline, and you're supposed to not allow these other influences and the goodies or other material rewards that might come with that interfere with your practice. And as we know from loads of sociological research, that people are influenced, right? I mean, the whole thing about doctors getting free pens and junkets to Hawaii and various places is certainly an important example. That and it doesn't often take a bunch of things to influence professionals even. I think there's a bunch of work on doctors who are given opportunities to give speeches on behalf of like a drug company or something like that. And it turns out that those speeches don't typically influence the doctors in the audience, but they certainly do influence the doctor that's on the stage in terms of their prescribing behavior. So I think that's another interesting angle to the the idea that these professional honors can sometimes be trapped in a certain sense.
Yeah, I once worked with an internal medicine physician at an academic medical center who said that he didn't trust himself, so just refused to interact with companies, full stop. Right now, he could do that because he was an internal medicine doctor, and to do his research, he didn't need any relationship with companies. Whereas if you're in other areas, if you want to do research, you can't take a holier than thou perspective, right? So there is something at stake for some folks. And so when you get the descriptions in JAMA about how there must be a complete severing of ties between companies and doctors, they always come from people who can do their research without relationships with these companies. So it's hard. And so what it suggests is that we need to think about stratification within the professions themselves, right? Because some doctors, they have to have these relationships if they are going to carry out their craft and do their research, but others, they're able to take a different position and still be successful.
So that's the easy for you to say reply. Awesome. Well, Dan, it's been so lovely to talk with you about your book, and thank you for your research and being so open about the fact that you got kicked out of your first field site. I just love these stories that are sort of behind the scenes about how people construct their scholarship, and really appreciate your time in this book. So thanks so much for joining us on The Annex.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's been great.
You've been listening to The Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Dan Morrison from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Thanks so much to our guest, Daniel Menchik from the University of Arizona. Thanks to our producer, to Joe Cohen, who directs the Queen's Podcast Lab at the City University of New York, Queens College. And thanks to Lena Orsa, who does our music.